Well, good afternoon, friends and supporters of ARPA Canada. It's so good to be able to interact with you this afternoon on this day about a very important issue that many of us are struggling to understand, struggling to apply to our lives, whether as individuals or in relation to families, churches, the civil government, and so on. And that's the issue of conscience, freedom of conscience. And ARPA Canada has been wrestling with this question for the last 6 months. In fact, for the last half year or so, our policy analyst, Daniel Zackfeld, has been our principal researcher and drafter of our latest policy report, that is Conscience in Healthcare. We've just released this report this fall, a week ago or so, and I'm so pleased to have Daniel come on to this live cast and to be able to explain a little bit about freedom of conscience, particularly within the area or the realm of healthcare, and apply that issue, explain it to you. And then after Daniel's done doing that, I'm going to join him again. We're going to have a conversation together and take questions from you, our audience. Freedom of conscience is a very important issue. It's the first of our fundamental freedoms in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it is something that is deep and intrinsic to each of us. And I have been taking phone calls from pastors, from nurses, from civil servants, from moms and dads, from university students for the last number of months now with questions that do turn on this question as well. Obviously, our constituents are concerned about it. They want to know more about it. They want to wrestle through this issue. And so I'm very hopeful that when Daniel joins us, we'll be able to bring a little bit more clarity to this issue for you and for the benefit of the church as we find our place in Canada today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, ARPA Canada's policy analyst, Daniel Zackfeld.
Well, thanks, Andre. As Andre mentioned, we recently released our latest policy report on freedom of conscience, and I wanted to give a brief presentation to begin our discussion about the issue today. So it is a topic that I think is increasingly relevant and which our society doesn't always understand. Now, there's a number of different things that someone might think of when we think of the word conscience. Maybe we begin by thinking of times we've gotten a guilty conscience. Or maybe we think of a little voice in your ear that tells you what to do. Maybe we think of this. So I'm going to play a little video clip in a minute. And in this case, it's from the Emperor's New Groove. And Kronk was ordered to kill the Emperor. And now the Emperor is in the river and he's debating whether or not he should save him. And this is a common example of a cartoon depiction of conscience.
Trying to lead you down the path of righteousness. I'm going to lead you down the path that rocks.
I'll come off it.
You come off it. You Infinity. Listen up, big guy. I got 3 good reasons why you should just walk away. Number 1, look at that guy. He's got that sissy stringy music, right?
We've been through this. It's all over. And you know it.
All right. That's a heart. And that's a dress.
Wrong.
Reason number 2.
What does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
Listen, you guys. You sort of confuse me, so, be gone. Or, however I get rid of you guys.
So in these kind of examples, the angel usually refers to conscience and the devil to temptation, one pressuring you to do right and the other tempting you to do wrong. That's not really what we're gonna be talking about today. Conscience is a little bit different than that. The conscience is not a way to hear the voice of God, represented by the angel, or the voice of the devil, but instead we'll look at how conscience points more to our own value system. So to do that, we want to start with a bit of a definition of conscience. And one book defines conscience as quote, your consciousness of what you believe is right and wrong. So it's what you believe is right and wrong, not necessarily what is objectively right and wrong. Another definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary is this: the sense or consciousness of the moral goodness or blameworthiness of one's own conduct, intentions, or character, together with a feeling of obligation to do right or to be good. So this definition really focuses on the fact that it's your own conduct, past and future. After all, you don't get a guilty conscience because of what someone else did. Your conscience ultimately condemns or excuses yourself. So I want to briefly go through 5 different things. So first, we want to go through a few historical references and examples of conscience, looking at how it's developed throughout history, but also how it's been an important topic for thousands of years. Next, we're going to look at the foundations for freedom of conscience. Third, conscience and the Bible. Fourth, what conscience is not, some common misunderstandings. And then finally, a current example of freedom of conscience, especially as related to the healthcare sector in Canada. So first, we want to look at some historical examples and references to conscience. The idea of conscience extends back into the Old Testament. And you remember the story of Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar commanded that everyone in his realm bow down to the image that he had made. And these 3 friends of Daniel, they could not do so. They would not do so, despite being threatened with death. They knew that the God of Israel was the only true God, and they couldn't act otherwise, no matter what happened or what the consequences might be. The New Testament also speaks of conscience in various places. The Apostle Paul explains the conscience as something that judges past actions and helps inform future actions. We also read in various places of the importance of having a good conscience. It's a God-given guide to help inform us how we should act. Moving forward to the 3rd century AD, Origen, a Christian scholar and theologian, defined conscience like this: it's a guide and companion, as it were, to admonish it to do what is better or to correct and convict it of faults. Then we go on to the Reformation. We call the story of Martin Luther. So in 1517, he wrote his 95 theses and nailed them to the church at Wittenberg. Then in 1521, Luther was excommunicated by the Pope and was ordered to defend his beliefs before the emperor at the Diet of Worms. There, Luther was ordered to recant and turn back to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, to which he replied, "I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." So again, he knows that to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. What he's standing on, he believes is biblical, and he can't go against that, no matter what the consequences might be. Moving on to the early 20th century, Abraham Kuyper was a theologian and pastor, a politician, and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands in the early 1900s. And he looked at conscience also from a more of a political perspective. He explains that the conscience helps protect against overreach by the government. So the conscience, he says, is the shield of the human person, the root of civil liberties, and the source of a nation's happiness. So it's the shield of the human person against government overreach and abuse by the government. But the actual term conscientious objector was not popularized until the World Wars. So the Canadian government at the time ordered that all eligible men must join the war effort. And they allowed some exceptions due to conscience, but this was difficult to obtain. Now, many people believed as part of their religion that they must not carry a gun and that they must not work on the Sabbath day. You have the examples of Mennonites or Seventh-day Adventists who held to those beliefs, and these stances were often ridiculed, and people were mocked if they tried to serve them in the military in other ways. And many conscientious objectors believed that they would be sinning if they disobeyed their conscience in this case, even if that meant disobeying a commanding officer as a result. That brings us to our second point, the foundation for freedom of conscience. And one of the key components behind conscience is the concept of authority. Everyone has different authorities in our lives. So whether it's our parents, our church leadership, employers, government, everyone has those authorities. But the only one who is sovereign over our conscience is God. So if an authority in one of these areas asks us to disobey our conscience, God is the ultimate judge of the conscience. And God has given authority to these people. So their authority is legitimate, but it's also limited. Now, that's not licensed to do whatever we want, because we are called to respect and obey authority. But if we're commanded to do what we believe is sin, then we can appeal to freedom of conscience. So that brings us to this idea of the supremacy of God. The preamble to Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms says, "Whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law." So this points us to the fact that there's no authority on earth which is all-powerful. God is the only one that has no limits to his authority, and he gives authority to various people over various aspects. God is the only authority over our conscience, and our conscience is answerable to him. So that's where sphere sovereignty comes into the picture as well. There's earthly authorities in each of these spheres, in the state, in the church, in the family, in society, and ultimately, all of them are subject to Christ. But every individual, whether the authorities or those who they are authorities over, also has their conscience subject to Christ and to Christ alone. So freedom of conscience is the ability to break possibly from an accepted norm and to appeal to a higher authority. So that brings us to the third point, conscience and the Bible. So first of all, conscience is seen as a moral compass that helps us understand what is right and wrong. God created all human beings with a conscience. So there's an understanding of morality, of right and wrong in both Christians and non-Christians. The Apostle Paul explains the conscience as something that helps people judge what they've done and to understand how they should act in the present and in the future. In Acts 24, Paul says, "I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men." So the idea of having a good conscience. In Romans 2, verse 14 and 15, we read, "For when Gentiles who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them." So the conscience applies to both believers and to unbelievers. But the conscience is ultimately subjective. People don't have identical consciences to each other, and our conscience is between us and God, like we've said. So sometimes our conscience might say, well, it's wrong for me and it's wrong for everyone, if it's more of an objective principle. But other times, our conscience might realize that something is wrong for me, but not for others. Or it might recognize that something that's okay for me can be wrong for other people. And this applies for various principles that Christians disagree on. So you hear people in society saying, I'll do what I think is right, you do what you think is right, and we're all happy. But that's not what I'm saying here at all. There's definite objective principles of right and wrong as explained in the Bible. The conscience helps us to apply those biblical principles to specific scenarios. And we should try to follow our conscience and make sure it's in line with the Bible, because the conscience can also be mistaken. So the Bible explains that the conscience can be hardened if we ignore it. Sin can cause our conscience to be further corrupted, where we think something is not a sin, but it is. Or there's times where the conscience can be overly sensitive, where we think something is a sin, but it isn't. And it's wrong for us to disobey our conscience unless it's in direct conflict with the Word of God, because then we're doing something that we believe is a sin. Now, we often tend to think that our conscience aligns perfectly with God's will, but that's not the case. So, yes, certain principles are objective and commanded in God's Word, and those are ones that all Christians must follow. But Christians are guided also by conscience on many issues that we disagree on. So let's move on to the fourth point, what conscience is not, some common misunderstandings of conscience. So first of all, conscience is not just a personal choice or a personal preference. You can take, for example, a religious objection to eating certain kind of meat. If that objection isn't being honored in a given circumstance, some people might suggest, oh, you can simply change your conscience or adjust your preferences, make yourself like it. But you might be able to do that if it is simply a preference. But conscience is a moral belief which helps shape how a person views the world and provides a framework for how they act, and it can't simply be changed. Second, conscience is different from absolute individual autonomy. Individual autonomy literally means self-law, and it states that you shouldn't interfere with my choices because I'm the ultimate authority over my own life. Now, conscience, as we've discussed, it respects other authorities and it respects limitations. Conscience is a proper respect for authority and ultimately for the sovereignty of God. So freedom of conscience respects a limited sphere of individual authority. There is freedom to do what we wish, but also still recognizing other legitimate authorities that can impose obligations on us. Thirdly, although often included with freedom of religion, freedom of conscience is a distinct category. Conscience implies a moral standard about what is good. So they're subjective beliefs, although they're rooted in a higher authority. And non-Christians and Christians might come to the same moral conclusions from different perspectives. For Christians, our conscience is rooted in our beliefs about what the Bible is telling us to do or not to do. For non-Christians, although they are still subject to God's law, they might follow science, reason, or other religions as their higher authority because they don't recognize God as their authority. On the other hand, freedom of religion refers to organized religion and the corporate beliefs of that religion. And finally, conscience is not entirely unlimited. As much as possible, it should be respected and accommodated, but it's not entirely unlimited. Some people might abuse the ability to claim conscientious objection out of selfishness or out of seeking dishonest gain. For example, if I was required to go to war, I certainly wouldn't want to, but I don't believe it's a sin, so I can't appeal to freedom of conscience. Nonetheless, conscience should still be limited if someone wishes to commit evil or injustice based on their conscience. The state has power also to compel people to fulfill certain civic responsibilities, like paying taxes, even if someone objects to that. If the state does limit conscience, though, they need to justify themselves and provide good reason for doing so. To quote Abraham Kuyper again, he says, quote, the only point of support that has ultimately proved invincible and indomitable over against the power of the state is the conscience. So again, the idea that the conscience protects against abuse by the state. So we're going to move on to the final point, and that's the example of freedom of conscience in healthcare. So today's problems around freedom of conscience might be less obvious sometimes than historical issues. They often happen in select areas, partly depending what kind of career we're in or what kind of work we do. And in some ways, it is beginning also to affect more people personally. So looking at healthcare specifically, things like abortion, assisted suicide, sex reassignment surgery, they're all legal in Canada. And doctors who believe these procedures, these practices are wrong, often run into problems if they're asked by a patient to provide one of these procedures. Medical professionals in Canada are regulated through what are called regulatory colleges. So these colleges ensure that doctors are acting ethically and treating patients well, and if a doctor behaves improperly, the regulatory college might suspend or remove his license to practice medicine. So the regulatory college in Ontario has one of the most restrictive policies around conscience in Canada, and they created a policy stating that if doctors conscientiously object to providing abortion or euthanasia, they still must provide an effective referral. So this means that they must actively connect the patient with another doctor who will provide that service. The doctor has to make sure the patient can access euthanasia and isn't allowed to talk about his moral disagreement or suggesting other options or simply declining to provide that procedure. If they do, they might lose their job. Now, many doctors, both Christians and non-Christians, might object to this for various different reasons, but ultimately because they believe participating in taking human life is wrong. I'm going to play just a brief video here of some concerned doctors within Ontario.
There's a big conflict between my beliefs and my conscience and what the college is requiring of me.
If I'm going to refer a client for a procedure or perform or assist with a procedure, it means I'm participating and endorsing that this procedure is good for the patient.
If they choose to do something that I know to be harmful to them, I can't support them or enable them in doing that. But I will always be there to provide any support that I can provide.
If I refer somebody for something like physician-assisted dying, which I won't do, I would feel that I was being complicit in it.
I'm not aware of any jurisdiction in the world where people are forced to act against their own conscience.
I'm concerned that other physicians who feel like me would leave the province and will even be more short of physicians than we already are.
I know that I will not compromise my conscience, that no job is worth that. But I hope that I won't have to make that final sacrifice.
The Alberta system, I think, is one of the best, that they have a multidisciplinary team that patients can access directly. In hospital, we frequently transfer patients for a variety of reasons between colleagues and specialties, depending on the needs of the patient. And conscientious objection should just be one of those reasons.
So some organizations brought the college to court over that policy. And the court said that the policy did limit doctors' freedom of religion. They didn't look at freedom of conscience. But they said this was justified because the college was trying to ensure that patients could access services that the government had legalized. Meanwhile, for other medical procedures and services, doctors don't have to give a patient exactly what they ask for. Rather, they focus on what is best for the patient and can use their professional experience and their ethical opinions to make those decisions. And if the patient doesn't like the doctor's opinion, they can also go to a different doctor and get a second opinion. But the Canadian medical system doesn't recognize the importance of conscience. It's important for doctors to be able to disagree openly so that they can continue serving their patients in a way that's good for their patients. Sometimes the law and the accepted medical approach is wrong, and conscientious objectors should be allowed to say that and to act accordingly. You could look also at other examples in Canada where freedom of conscience is not accommodated or respected. For example, marriage commissioners are not permitted to refuse to participate in same-sex weddings. Or we've likely all seen stories of businesses who refuse to provide a service that violates their conscience, such as photography for a same-sex wedding or printing pro-abortion pamphlets, and these businesses often get penalized by the public or by the courts. And the principles in our policy report focus on conscience in healthcare, but they can and should also be applied to scenarios like these, to other scenarios within the Canadian context. Now, just to wrap up, we can continue to encourage our elected officials to respect conscience, and we have a number of recommendations at the end of the policy report to that effect as well. But we can remind them that the government doesn't have ultimate authority over the way that people act, even if they do have authority over many areas of our lives. Our nation was built on the idea of the supremacy of God, and our elected officials can be reminded that their authority is legitimate but also limited, and that God is the only authority over the conscience. So from there, we'll transition to question and answer period now. Feel free to put any questions you have in the box underneath the video, and André and I will be having more of a discussion after this.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Daniel. It was really, really interesting. I mean, you and I have been going back and forth on the draft of the report for many months now, and still just standing back and listening to you present it was really quite interesting to hear it all over again. And I find it a fascinating subject. For those of you who are interested to read the actual report, again, this is what the report looks like, Conscience in Healthcare. It is available free, obviously, online at arpacanada.ca. And if you go to our publications tab, under there you'll find policy reports, and this is the newest policy report on our website. So do check it out, read the report for yourself. And again, if you have any questions for us at all, please do pop them in the comment bubble or the comment section underneath this video, and we'll do our best to engage with that. But yeah, just turning back to you, Daniel, and thanks again for all of the work you did pour into this report. I'm not sure how many books you had to read and how many articles you had to read in order to write this report. There's over 80 different references in the report, so a lot of work went into it. And there's a lot of peer review that went into it as well. I mean, other staff from ARPA reviewed this document, gave their input. The board itself did. You passed it by doctors. You passed it by a PhD in law who had specialized in freedom of conscience. He reviewed it as well. Theologians reviewed it. So a lot of effort went into this because it is such a complex issue, and we want to try to get it right. So thanks again for sticking through with it for the last 6 months. Do you want to dig into this question about the difference between not doing what is wrong versus not being able to do what is right? Does conscience interact differently with those two kinds of scenarios? So for example, if conscience says you interacts with something that says you're not allowed to do what is right, so you feel you ought to do something, but let's say the civil government is prohibiting you from doing what is right. Is there a different kind of conscience claim there than if you are being compelled to do something that you think is wrong, like for example, a physician being compelled to participate in medical assistance in dying or euthanasia?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things on that, and this is something that I thought about a fair bit while writing this, because it gets difficult when there's certain things that people say, well, I have to be able to do this, and there's definitely many things that the government actually prohibits, and the government should prohibit many things. There's the criminal code, and many things that are criminal acts are prohibited. In terms of things the government can compel, there are some things like paying taxes, for example, but there are much fewer examples of things that the government can actually compel. I think too there's in the research they talk about this. A number of people talk about this concept of moral harm.
Okay.
And the idea that doing something that you believe is wrong is more harmful to your sense of morality, to your idea of right and wrong, than the ability to do what you believe is right. And partly because the ability to do what is right can often be done in other ways. So if you believe that you should be doing something, you can often do that. If you're not allowed in a specific way, you can often do that in another way.
Right. So that's a good point, because I think when we're told thou shalt not by God, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, and the government says, no, you must do this now. Let's just stick with thou shalt not kill. No, now you must do it. So whether that's a doctor who says I can't do assisted suicide or abortion for that reason, or whether it's a conscientious objector to war. Some Christians are pacifist and are convicted that they cannot, you mentioned this in your presentation, cannot take up arms against the enemy. So they feel they're being compelled to do the thing that God says thou shalt not do. Those are relatively easy issues in the sense that they're black and white and they're immediate, right? It's an absolute prohibition from God, and the government's saying you should do it, and so it's an immediate infringement, an immediate moral wrong. Whereas if it's that God says honor your father and your mother, or gather for worship, those are not always all the time being imposed on us or expected of us from God. I'm not always interacting with my parents. I'm not always corporately worshiping. And so when the civil government imposes on that or puts limits on that, let's say says I can't visit my parents who are locked up due to COVID, and they're feeling isolated. Well, there's an infringement there, but there might be creative ways around that. Same thing with corporate worship, right? Then it's not as clear. It's a little bit more murky. It takes a bit more work to reason through. So yeah, it becomes a more difficult issue to work through. I wonder if it even connects to sins of omission versus sins of commission, and how we understand conscience in relation to that. And that kind of makes me think of the whole question of conscience not being mere license. So I've used it this way as a rule of thumb. Feel free to push back if I've got it wrong here. But a rule of thumb with conscience would be it's a grave thing. It's something that if you believe something is sin and you're being compelled to do it, or if you believe something would be sin if you didn't do it but you're being prevented from doing it, that as a rule of thumb, that would be engaging your conscience. But if it's, like you said in your presentation, if it's more preference, or even that you really feel strongly that you should or shouldn't, but doesn't quite rise to the level of sin, then perhaps it's not a freedom of conscience issue. Would that be a fair rule of thumb?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because there's definitely a lot of cases where people it might be just a preference, or it might be something that someone wants to do. Like I gave the example of if I was called to go to war, I couldn't be a conscientious objector because I don't believe that it would be a sin for me to do so. I'd probably try to find other ways to get out of it, but I can't use the freedom of conscience aspect of that.
Right. And if I can apply that to one of the hot button issues right now in Canada within our churches is the question of vaccines. There's some Christians who believe it would be sin to take the vaccine for various reasons. They believe that. But there's others who really don't want to take the vaccine, but they can't quite say it would be sin if they did. And so for those who are in that latter category, you can't claim a conscience. You can't make a conscience claim. You can make other claims. It might still be legally unfair, and you should be maybe still accommodated, and so on. But the conscience claim isn't there for the group that says, well, I can't honestly in good faith say this is sin, and therefore it wouldn't qualify as a freedom of conscience infringement necessarily. That might be a practical example to make that clearer. Also, I think it's more than just license as well. I remember having a debate even in high school with some fellow high school students where we were talking about issues around human sexuality and human reproduction. And one of my classmates made a comment along the lines of, well, as long as I pray about it and I don't feel guilty, then it can't be sin because I don't feel guilty. My conscience is clear. Do you want to interact with that one at all? Like, does that because that strikes me as using conscience as license. Well, as long as I have a clear conscience, I'm allowed to do it. You can't say, no one else is allowed to say what I'm engaging in is sin or is immoral. But is that what conscience is about? Like, is there a problem with using it that way?
Yeah. I mean, we see in the New Testament, Paul talks about having a good conscience, but I don't think in that case he means just that he's not feeling guilty about doing something. He actually believes that this is what God's will is, and this is the way I'm trying to follow it, and that's why he can say that he has a good conscience before God and men. I think there's often times where we think that our conscience is correct. And many times it is. Many times it's based on biblical principles. But there's also many times where our conscience can be mistaken. So like I mentioned in the presentation as well, our conscience can be oversensitive or it can be undersensitive. So we might think that something's a sin and it's not, or we might fail to think something's a sin and it is. And sometimes in cases where something is a sin, but we don't feel guilty about doing it, it's because we maybe when we were younger we thought it was, and then we still did that thing, and then slowly but surely our conscience stopped reprimanding us for it.
Okay. I got a couple of other things that I thought I'd comment on and engage you on, but just a reminder for those who are tuning in. Please do feel free to type your questions in the comment box underneath the video, and we'll do our best to get to them in just a moment. Just a couple more comments with Daniel here. I was thinking about the law. I'm a lawyer, so that's kind of what I do. And I was thinking about how the Supreme Court of Canada has engaged on the question of conscience a little bit. So there's actually not been a clear Supreme Court of Canada decision on freedom of conscience proper. We have lots of freedom of religion cases, not any Supreme Court of Canada cases that deal specifically with freedom of conscience. And yet, the Supreme Court has talked about freedom of conscience multiple times, even in the very first freedom of religion case called Big M Drug Mart. The RV Big M Drug Mart is the name of the case from 1985. And that case, Chief Justice Dixon, at the time, he's writing the decision, and he says that conscience is the foundational, fundamental freedom that on which all of our other fundamental freedoms actually rest. So, so that's an interesting point, I think, because, and actually, legal philosopher John Whitty actually makes a similar comment that actually that's one of the big contributions of Calvinism to the development of law in the last 500 years is this idea of freedom of conscience as a limiting force, and a force that actually supports the idea of other fundamental freedoms, including freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. They're rooted in freedom of conscience, and Calvinism and the Reformation really brought about this high respect for the conscience under the authority of God, under the lordship of Christ. So I think that's a really interesting thing. That's one of the big contributions of the Reformation to modern, even modern secular law, that it's developed out of the Reformation in that way. The last thing I thought I would comment on, and welcome your feedback on as well, is in the report we talk about what philosopher William Galston describes as maximum feasible accommodation. And he says that in order for liberal democracies like Canada, United States, Europe, in order for them to resist what he calls civic totalism, which is where the civic realm manifests particularly in this civil government, that they can become totalist, they can become the final arbiter of all things. They can be the final authority in all things. And you mentioned in your presentation as well that no, there's limited authority. There's lots of different earthly authorities, all under Christ, civil government, your church, your employer, your family, and so on. But that we have to resist the idea of civic totalism, where the sphere of the state becomes the final authority in all matters. And William Galston says the way to push back against civic totalism is through policies of maximum feasible accommodation. And maybe you want to comment on that. I know Kuiper has spoken about that in a way, and maybe that's something we need to be thinking about in relation to ethics in medicine. How do we deal with doctors or nurses who have ethical objections or conscientious objections? Perhaps that should describe the way Christian employers deal with employees. Perhaps that's the way Christian elders and pastors need to deal with people within their congregations. What do you think of that concept of maximum feasible accommodation?
Yeah, so there's definitely a sense where there's times where the government thinks, well, we need to do this. Mm-hmm. So just to use the example of conscientious objectors in war, mm-hmm. then it's a question of, do we have enough manpower mm-hmm. to defend the country? Mm-hmm. Or do we need to require everyone, whether or not they have a conscientious objection, right. to join the army so that we can actually defend the country? Mm-hmm. So there's often a balance that the government is trying to make, mm-hmm. but in many cases they get that balance wrong, and they fail to, they might say they're accommodating in certain circumstances, but not doing so to the maximum extent they can. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the case of conscientious objectors, with the example we provided for Ontario, mm-hmm. There's most of the other provinces have less restrictive policies for conscientious objectors. Mm-hmm. So it's not that this policy is necessary, mm-hmm. Even if the state wants to achieve its objectives. Mm-hmm. It's not that this policy is necessary for that to happen. There mm-hmm. are less restrictive ways that they can do that. Mm-hmm. And they can do that also by allowing doctors and nurses to have freedom of conscience. Mm-hmm. And then if they are concerned about access, to services dealing with that themselves, as the government as well. The last recommendation in our policy report as well is regarding doctors and nurses who work in the healthcare sector and are being forced to get vaccinated right now. And just the idea that that's not a maximum accommodation because there's options such as testing or other ways around the problem where the government can meet its objectives and respect the conscience of doctors and nurses.
Yeah, no, for sure. And actually, I really do like that the report opens with the conscientious objectors in war, because it's far enough in the distance historically for us to be a bit more objective about it. We're not in the middle of that tension right now. I mean, if we were in the middle of war right now and the federal government was thinking about conscripting people in order to fight the Nazis, I think it might twist our analysis around freedom of conscience and conscientious objectors and so on. And so thankfully it's a historic example, it's a real one, a true one, but it's far enough away, distant enough away that we can be a little bit objective about it. A couple of thoughts actually just on it as you were speaking. I mean, one aspect is that if there is a conscientious objector in a time of war, you can imagine that that's a really tough position to be in. I mean, the majority of the population is needing young men to go and fight and defend the country. Most other young men are going. And so if you're objecting, you look in the eyes of others like a coward or like somebody who's trying to dodge their responsibility and so on. And yet that's not actually the case. What they're trying to do is to honor their conscience and not do wrong, not do sin. And I guess another comment, what I'm saying is that a conscientious objector doesn't make those objections flippantly. Like, it comes at quite a big cost. And that's the other aspect of conscientious objection, is that if you believe your conscience is being violated, it doesn't mean that it should never be infringed on without any repercussions. Every person who makes a conscientious claim, there's always going to be a cost involved. If there's no cost involved, are you really exercising your conscience? Probably not. So we shouldn't think that freedom of conscience means we can never be inconvenienced in order for our consciences to be honored and respected. Sometimes there is going to be an inconvenience. So, for example, in the case of a conscientious objector, they don't get to say, well, I have a conscientious objection to war, and therefore I'm not going to be participating at all, and I just get to go on my merry way and do whatever I want, even though 90% of the other population is fighting to defend the country. So what is the inconvenience for that conscientious objector? It might be, well, you have to serve as a cook, or you have to serve as a behind the front lines as a medic or something like that. And that's where an excellent film, Hacksaw Ridge, actually plays that out, where a conscientious objector does serve as a medic and never touches a weapon. All right, well, we have a question that's come through. And again, if anybody has any questions for themselves on freedom of conscience, please do pop them in the comment bubble below. And so one of the questions is, have the legal options in Ontario been exhausted, and are there ways to still challenge the law forcing doctors to refer? Do you want to comment on that? I have a couple thoughts, but did you have any?
I'll let you go at it from a legal perspective.
All right. Well, so the case that Daniel did talk about involving doctors who are challenging the policy in Ontario, it was argued at the trial level in Ontario, and then it went up to the Ontario Court of Appeal, and the objecting physicians lost at both levels. And so they ended the case there. They could have applied to the Supreme Court of Canada, appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, but with the two losses, I think they wanted to, I think there's probably strategic reasons that they stopped there. But there's been some interesting developments since then. Of course, after the Court of Appeal decision saying that doctors did have to refer to other doctors, in the meantime now, Parliament has actually expanded euthanasia in radical ways. So what we've seen is that Bill C-7 was passed earlier this year, I think. Yes, in March, right? Yeah, okay, good thing our policy analyst is paying attention. So earlier this year, we saw that euthanasia was radically expanded, including to people who are not yet dying, might be expanded yet again in about a year or so from now to people whose sole underlying condition is a mental health concern, mental illness. And so that means that even more doctors are going to be implicated. Even more doctors are very concerned about this idea of referring a patient who they think, in the best interest of the patient, should not be made eligible for MAID. And so I think we might have an option to re-challenge this policy. So definitely the facts have changed. And there's other legal arguments that can also be made. So we may yet see another challenge in Ontario to the policy, and perhaps even see it pushed all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Yeah, and from a policy side of that too, I would say that there is push in some provinces to actually change the legislation around that to protect doctors' conscience specifically. Mm-hmm. So even outside of legal challenges, there may be ways that the legislatures can protect doctors without those legal challenges having to happen. For example, in Manitoba, they have a bill or law now they passed in 2017, I believe, to protect doctors in when they're asked to provide MAID.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's an excellent point. Actually, I'm very glad you raised that, Daniel, because in law, the decisions of judges can be amended or responded to by the legislature, and definitely agree with you. There is an option for the province of Ontario to pass a law to protect conscience rights, and there's nothing stopping them from doing that. So at least legally speaking, I mean, maybe there's social pressure for them to not do something, but in fact, we have a call to action. Do we have an easy mail on that or not?
We do. Yeah.
Okay. So if you're listening and you think doctors in Ontario should have their consciences protected and that the Ontario government should act on that, do check out our easy mail for that. We have another question. Would it be a conscience claim in regards to vaccination if you're aware of how lethal it has been worldwide? Do you want to interact with that one first? Would it become a freedom of conscience issue if you're aware of how lethal the vaccine has been worldwide?
Yeah. So I think one thing is to be able to have a reasonable connection to biblical principles. Mm-hmm. So if you believe that the vaccine is going to be harmful to your health, or that it might cause illness or death or any other problems, there could be a connection to the Sixth Commandment and to protecting your own health and well-being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you're right. So I mean, just the simple fact that there have been adverse effects related to the vaccine, worldwide, including lethal effects in some cases. That fact alone would not be enough. Like, it would have to be connected to that you are convicted that taking that vaccine then is a risk to your health and your well-being, and it's a risk that's unacceptable according to the principles in Scripture. And so thus tipping you into the point where you believe it would be sin to take the vaccine because it would be too great a risk. I think you'd have to go beyond just a mere fact, a statistical fact, as to dig deep into those biblical principles for sure. Got another question here. Article 32 of the Belgic Confession talks about the introduction of human intervention and laws being introduced into the worship service that bind the conscience. How would we understand that in regards to church members demanding others wear masks or be vaxxed in order to stand in unity with other office bearers or members? That was a interesting one. Do you want to take that one first, or?
Yeah, I think the big thing with this is that it's one of those issues that Christians disagree on, and Christians can be serious Christians and disagree on it, and to connect it to conscience, you want to have biblical reasons why you believe something, to connect it to morality, right and wrong, and I think it's really a case where someone might feel compelled to wear a mask and to be vaccinated. Another person will feel compelled not to wear a mask and not to be vaccinated. And both of these can be based on the biblical principles, their idea of right and wrong, and just having those dialogues as well, and discussing that you can disagree and still be a faithful Christian at the same time.
Yeah, and I would tie it as well back to your discussion, Daniel, on authority as well. So again, conscience is not unmoored from authority; it's tied to authority. And so, if you're talking about a worship service, the one whom God has given the earthly authority that God has given to govern the worship service is the leadership of the church. So it's an office and an authority that they have to do carefully when they're leading the church and leading worship. So I would say that principle of maximum feasible accommodation that we talked about in relation to the civil government also applies to the church as a principle, that church leadership should be very, very careful about imposing on a conscientious objector within the church. Now, conscience, again, can be wrong, right? So our consciences should always be open to correction. So if you feel that you conscientiously cannot wear a mask in church, you're in that's understandable. Okay, that's a position you can have, but you must not make the error that says, and because I feel that way now, I can never be convinced otherwise. That my conscience cannot be in error. You have to be open to the idea that your conscience might be in error, and you have to be open to conversations and discussions with your church leadership about that. Now, it might be that you remain convicted that you can't wear one. That's also a possibility, and again, church leadership must be very careful not to violate the conscience of individuals. Again, I would want to be pretty emphatic here that a conscientious violation in relation to Mass would be that you believe it's a sin to wear the mask, not an inconvenience, not a hassle, not a ridiculous requirement in light of everything that's going on, but a sin, right? The standard is high because you are, in a church worship service, you're under the authority. God has put you under authority of the elders and the pastor. And same thing then with vaccination. Again, to the church leadership, I'd say you've got to be very cautious about imposing on people who have conscientious objections to the vaccine. I have more personal opinions on that actually, but maybe we'll just move on to the next question because there are a few more questions and it can be a debate that can be quite a heated debate. It's probably a better debate to have in person. Levi asks, if freedom of conscience has to do with the freedom not to do something that one thinks is sinful, well, how will that apply to people who have no concept of sin or view morality as relative? I think my first thought goes to that text that you quoted where Paul, writing in Romans 2, is it, where he says even the Gentiles, meaning the non-believers, even they have a conscience. And so in a mysterious sort of way, it does, even if people don't have an idea of sin in a biblical sense, in a sense of, oh, this violates this law of God or that law of God or this precept in the Word or that precept in the Word, nevertheless, God can still prick their consciences in other ways. So it's not that they lose their conscience altogether. And so I guess when I talk about a rule of thumb that conscience is engaged when we're talking about like whether or not this is a sin, it's a rule of thumb for fellow Christians. And maybe that kind of language would be lost a little bit on somebody who's not a Christian or doesn't understand the concept of sin or that sort of thing. But did you have any comment maybe even on the concept of people who view morality as relative or moral relativists?
Yeah, and I think even moral relativists have their own sense of morality, so they have their own beliefs about what is right and wrong. And like we said, conscience can be subjective in that sense, even though it is based on higher principles. And for a moral relativist, it could be based on any number of higher what they would claim are higher principles as well. Maybe science or maybe reason or other things. And I think in those cases, they still have this, there's certain things where if they're asked to do it, they would have this idea that, no, this is wrong for me to do it. I think maybe the example of euthanasia is kind of more of an extreme example because it is taking the life of another person. But you think of unbelieving doctors who have taken the Hippocratic Oath and they reference that as their conscientious objection because they've promised to do no harm, and they believe in that case that they would not be fulfilling their duty as a physician, so they'd be doing what's wrong. And they don't necessarily need a sense of biblical morality to be able to say that.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, a last question, and we only have 2 minutes left to answer it because we want to try to keep this all to 1 hour. It's a question from Deanna. What is it to bind the conscience? Some people use the word compelling. Is that a form of binding the conscience?
Yeah, I think behind that is the idea of saying that because my conscience says that I must do this thing or not do this thing, that means your conscience must be the same. And on some of these issues that Christians disagree on, we can't say that. We can't say my conscience is right for me, but it's also every Christian must adhere to this same belief, even especially where biblical principles are less clear. Where the biblical principles are clear, then every Christian should adhere to that. But I think binding another person's conscience is saying, even though you don't think this is a sin, you should be behaving like it is a sin because you're a Christian, so you must do that. Or even though you think this is not a sin, then you must act like it is a sin. So I think it's just the idea again that conscience can be subjective in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. All right, well, good timing. Good timing with the questions too, everyone, because that takes us right to the top of the hour. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for engaging, and we hope that this has been helpful. We welcome feedback on everything you've heard in the last hour. Please do send questions. Actually, I'll give Daniel's email. You can email Daniel directly at daniel@arpacanada.ca if you have questions about this conversation, and he'll do his best to get back to you with further thoughts or ideas or resources on this issue if you want to dig in further. Again, check out the report for yourself, arpacanada.ca, and go to the Publications tab, and under Publications look for our report on freedom, conscience in healthcare. Actually, let me double check. Colin, is it Publications tab or is it the Resources tab? Publications, okay, thanks. And a big thank you to Colin Postma, our Federal Issues Manager, who also does all of our background tech, and he's sitting in the background. You can't see him, but he's managed all the audio, the lighting, the video, and coordinating the questions for us. So thanks so much to Colin Postma for his help as well. Everyone, take care. God bless you, and have a good weekend.